Professor Eleanor Fish, who is a co-founder of BSI and also one of the true mentors in every sense of the word at the Department of Immunology, where she's worked on uncovering mechanisms of interferons for many, many years. And today she'll be presenting on effective presentation. So without taking any more time, please take it away, Eleanor.
So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is talk to you about how to create an effective scientific presentation. And Robbie, I am frustrated that I can't remove at the top of my screen this panel that's here.
We don't see it on our side, Eleanor.
Okay. All right. Well, if you don't see it, that's great. So what are the questions you have to ask yourself before you start to write your talk? So the very first thing I would say to you is, how much time do I have? So often when we attend conferences or symposia, there's a frustration that people run on too long, or else they race through their presentation. So the very first thing you should ask yourself, how much time do I have, and how do I pace myself? The next question you have to ask is, who is my audience? Is this an audience that's very broad, that perhaps don't know my discipline very well? I want to relay my message to everybody, so I have to alter my presentation, rethink it if it's not a specialist audience, as opposed to if it's a very specialized audience. So when you write your talk, know who your audience is. What do I want the audience to learn from my talk? Again, when you give a presentation, you have to bear in mind what is the key point you want the audience to walk away from your presentation with. What do you want them to learn? When you write your title, you need to state your main finding in your title. And you need to do this concisely. So often when people have their title page, the title is like 3 or 4 sentences long. Don't do that. You want to capture in your title very specifically what your talk is going to be about. And when you're planning your slides, what you should realize at the very beginning of your talk, your background information is where you're going to capture your audience. So we've heard about in grant writing and in writing an abstract that you want to capture the attention of your audience. So why are you giving this talk? Why is the subject matter relevant? Why would anybody care about it? So background information, generally speaking in a talk, maximum 2 or 3 slides. You want to just capture your audience. This is why it's important. Then you might want to talk about what your hypothesis is, what are the objectives of your particular presentation or your research project. But again, I wouldn't go into too much detail here. In fact, very often, once you've given your background information, you might very specifically launch into what your objectives were and how you accomplished them. The results section is the most important part of your presentation. I'll say that again. The results section is the most important part. And rather than have 10 or 15 background slides, this is the area where you want to have most of your slides. And you want to also, when you present those slides, interpret them. And I'll explain that in a moment. When you finish your presentation, when you've presented all your results, I would suggest that you have a single summary slide which covers the key or critical points of your results. Do not repeat exactly what you've said in each of your results sections, your results slides. So a summary slide would say, based on my results, these are the key points, the key takeaways, and the conclusions of my presentation. And then when you close your presentation, you want to acknowledge all those who've contributed to the work. A Again, the results section, including interpretation, is the most important section of your presentation. Let's now go to the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about making the slides. Use limited text. Honestly, there's nothing quite so difficult as to sit in front of a presentation where it's all just text. Quite honestly, you don't need to be there. If it's all just text, then I've always said to my graduate students and postdocs, just leave me with the slides and you can go and have a cup of coffee. If you're going to give a presentation, don't use too much text. And why do I say this? Because a simple visual is worth 1,000 words. So for example, here I'm showing you a map of the world where population size is indicated for each of the countries that are shown here. So for example, you can see in this area here, around India, the population is huge. So population in this slide, and in this panel, what I show you is the incidence of malaria. So you can see that compared to the Americas or compared to Japan or Europe, malaria is hugely prevalent across the African continent. So this particular slide, just with a visual, has covered a lot of information. It's told you where the world population is and the impact of a specific infection. It could have taken 10, 15 sentences, but this is much more powerful. The other point is whenever you use any slide, any visual, any image that is not your own, you should always reference it. That's an absolute. Always reference data that are not your own. So I'm going to now show you a couple of examples of what are difficult to follow. So this is a particular slide where there are many, many panels. It overwhelms your audience. Nobody is going to be able to look at this and run through all the panels. First of all, they shrink in size, so they're difficult to follow, and it's overwhelming. What's important here is that the individual who's presenting this slide has acknowledged who are the authors and where it's published. So that's important, but this is overwhelming. There's just too much information in a single slide for your audience to follow. Let me give you an example of something that, for example, I gave. This just shows, first of all, with the title, with the animation, that I've outlined exactly what the slide is going to discuss, that interferon treatment accelerates viral clearance by 7 days and reduces biomarkers of inflammation. Those are the two things that I'm going to show on this particular slide, and it's related, for your information, to SARS-CoV-2. In the left panel, it's the first one I introduce. Very succinctly, I've shown two things, two treatments. This one is called arbitol, and this is interferon. What I will then go on to say, this slide illustrates that individuals, days from symptom onset, from onset of their COVID symptoms, we saw the proportion of positive cases decline, and they declined much more rapidly on this treatment versus this treatment. So the point is, and I'm hoping you can see my pointer, this is the red graph versus the blue graph. So again, if your pointer doesn't work, if something goes wrong, explain in your panel what that figure exactly is and what the two lines are exactly. So every panel you show in a presentation, explain and refer to it. On the left-hand side of this slide, you can see a panel that shows the effects of two different treatments on acceleration of viral clearance. Then I introduce two new panels. And again, you need to explain what the blue and red plots are, reiterating that they reflect identically the blue and red plots in the left-hand panel. And I would say here, in these two panels, I show the effect of these treatments on interleukin-6 and on C-reactive protein, the left panel and the right panel, and you can see that, and then you describe exactly what you see. So for every figure, explain to your audience exactly what you see. And if the results are highly significant, again, you can see these two p-values that I've shown above the plots, mention that it's highly significant. I've also shown that these data are published and the references in the bottom of the panel. So just to reiterate, for every figure that you show, please explain to your audience what each figure illustrates and explain how you did this. Some other key points. Again, keep to the time allocated. Don't race through it. If you've only got 10 minutes, it's very hard for somebody to follow you if you're speaking very quickly and they have to keep up with you and they have to know all the data. Pace yourself. Practice your presentation so that you keep within the 10 minutes or the 30 minutes or the 1 hour. I urge you to use the same slide background and the same text fonts throughout. Again, this is just a more polished presentation if you use the same backgrounds and the same fonts throughout. Don't read notes. Look at your audience. The best presentations are when you show the slides, explain the data, and look at your audience. Let them see that you're engaging them in your presentation. If you're just reading from notes or just facing the slides that are being projected, this will not engage your audience. Look at them, pace yourself, pause. Vary the tone of your voice. If you're excited about your data, they'll be excited. If you keep a monotone throughout, again, it's difficult for an audience to follow. And tell a story that is easy to follow. And with that, I'm going to suggest that if there are any questions, now all I've talked about here is for an oral presentation, and I'm happy if there's time, we can talk about how you proceed with a poster presentation. But if there are any questions, fire away.
Thank you, Eleanor, for a very, very clear presentation on presentations. That was very easy to follow. Much appreciated. Maybe not as much questions, but just agreeing with you that knowing your audience is the most important aspect of how you structure the presentation, right? If, for example, you're doing a pitch presentation, it's a very different setup than if you're doing the latest results versus if you're doing kind of a review style presentation on what the field has done. I think in all of them, I would agree that there's kind of a perfect balance of the introduction. I don't know what your thoughts are, that sometimes people go way too long into the introduction. By the time it gets to their data, they've kind of
It's a
lost the
race to the
audience.
finish. Yes.
They're racing against time, right?
Yeah.
So what's your advice on that point? Is how do you ensure you get all the points across without losing the audience?
Well, I think the thing is to, again, appreciate the time frame you've got. If you've got a 10-minute presentation, the key is to, with your background, 1 or 2 slides maximum, because for a 10-minute presentation, I would argue 12 slides maximum, okay, independent of your title slide and your acknowledgement slides, but 10 tops, let's say. You need to capture your audience with the background. Why are you doing this? Why is it important? Then go into, you can say the objectives were, but I often think that it's better just to launch straight into what you did. And with the data slide, you can explain the method you used. Very often we've had in our conferences, certainly in the BSI conferences and other conferences that I've attended, trainees will spend a lot of time talking about the methods they used. You're going to lose your audience. Once you've told them the relevance and what your objectives were with your particular project, show them the results. And as you show them the results, you can say how you did the experiment. If it was an animal experiment, just a short cartoon of how you injected the mice, the time frame at the top or whatever. If you explain your panels, again, that's the biggest part of your presentation. So I agree with you. Don't spend too much introducing, because the key point is, what are your results? Why are you excited about this research? What is novel? First time that these results, first time these data, it's important.
Yeah, and I think one thing I found useful is it's maybe not as orthodox, but I think there's some value in considering to almost give an executive summary before you start that today I'm going to talk about this, we did this work, and so is the result. Prepare your audience. It's kind of, we're tricked into thinking you want to give a mystery presentation and reveal, pull the curtains at the end, which is great. You could still do that, but make sure your audience knows what they're in for because it gets them in the right frame of mind.
And very
And
often you can do that with your title. So, with your
yeah,
title, you can say, and I hope to convince you by the end of my presentation that, and again, whatever the statement is, that
yeah,
this is the most important therapeutic intervention you consider, that we've understood now how this particular cancer progresses, whatever. You can make that statement. So again, you don't necessarily have to have text because you're going to cover that in your presentation.
yeah. And I think something that captured my attention early on in my career, and you did it in this presentation, is having some sort of a very colorful visual that's not just a bar graph or something, at least every 10 minutes. So you had the world map for that example. Some people even use art or something like that if they have to. I remember TacMac likes to use these abstract art and give it, and I think that's a really important technique. It's almost when you're working on your computer and you look into the distance, and then suddenly your brain is able to refocus. That's the refocusing for your audience, right? Is give their brain a break so they can really pay attention to what you're saying without dozing off, listening about
And we
p-values,
saw that
right?
beautifully with Robin's presentation. Some of the
Yeah,
cartoons she flashed throughout. Absolutely.
yeah. So with that, maybe I'll ask a few of the questions from the audience, Eleanor. So Ahmed asks, how does one reference their own results? I assume he's talking probably about if they're published already. Um,
Yeah, so there are two ways. If it's unpublished data, you just put a little note at the bottom of that figure or panels, unpublished data. And if it's been published, as I showed you in the slide set, which will be posted on our website, you just put the citation there in whichever way you want, but authors, year, and the publication, and the title. So you cite your own work either as unpublished or with the appropriate publication.
that's great. We have one participant who's asking about tips for poster presentations, but I imagine that'll be a bigger discussion. Before that, I want to also get to another question that is, how do you adapt your presentation for different formats, such as conferences, webinars, or smaller workshops?
So conferences, so there's a difference between in-person and an online. Let's start with that. So in person, I find, as someone who's given many presentations, is much easier. You face your audience, you can see that they're engaged or not, you can adjust your pace, your tone, you can revise how you present, you can move around to engage them. So an in-person, look at your audience and engage them. That's point number one. For a webinar or on any sort of online, it's much harder. So really, your visuals have to be, much more engaging. You can certainly with your tone of voice, with your pace, but your body language isn't going to be picked up. So with an online presentation, your presentation itself has to be really, really tight.
And then that's great. And about posters, what would you say are some tips? And
Yeah.
I also want to encourage the audience in the meantime, if you have other questions, this is your chance to ask them.
So poster presentations. Again, this is an area where we see as reviewers, for conferences, for whatever, many different kinds of presentations. So certainly a lot of it is affected, well, not some of it is a budget constraint. So not everybody has access to these beautiful single poster board size laminated posters. So if you have one of those, that's great. But if you don't, you're going to have to take single letter size sheets or legal size sheets and put the various sections together and pin it up on a poster board. But for all of these, bear in mind that the visual is really important. So you have to have a title that'll capture people as they're walking across, walking around a room with 50, 60 posters, or going to a site where there are tons of posters. Capture your audience with a title that's going to engage them. And that below the title, you have to have the authors and the affiliations. In your poster, again, your background, your summary, your abstract should capture an audience. Why do they want to see this particular poster? And I would argue that having a poster on a poster board size with 30 different panels is going to drive your audience crazy. So reduce the number of panels that are easy to follow and get your point across. You're not going to have to be able to go into great details about the methods. That's not what a poster should capture. It should capture, this is the subject I'm interested in. This is why we did it. This is our hypothesis, and these are the results. And through your results, you can put some of the methods, and then you need your conclusions. Future directions, some people put in. The other opportunity is if you're standing beside a poster, somebody will ask you, so where are you going next? And then you can launch into your future directions. And then obviously your acknowledgements and references. But the most successful posters that I've seen are ones that can convey the importance of the project and have a limited number of panels that are very clear to follow, whether you're standing beside your poster or not. That somebody can follow that poster and understand what the key points are.
That's very good advice. One or two things I can add from my perspective, I think having a cartoon, easy to follow methods, let's say if you're talking about a way to generate certain cell type out of stem cells, it's kind of important to have that outline in an easy to follow cartoon way rather than just show the results because
Exactly.
people will wonder that and it's hard to read that through, the methods section just from text. The other thought is, and we've seen this sometimes in previous BSI submissions, is people will, let's say, really blow up a pathology slide or even a picture of some sort of, disease state, and it's not representative. I think it's important if you have more than one data point to make sure you rather, make those representative examples small, but make sure you do show overall where your data stands so it doesn't look like you're cherry picking, what your hypothesis is without backing it up with data across different samples.
And indeed, if they go to the BSI website and go to our past conferences, if they flick through the posters, you'll get an immediate impression of which are the good posters, which are easy to follow. So I'd urge you again, as we do with grants or with anything, have a look at what's successful, what's been published.
Yeah, I recognize a few past poster winners in the audience today, so you have lots of good inspiration on the website.
I think there's some questions. Somebody had their hand up. Princess, you had your hand up? Can we
Princess,
unmute Princess?
he did ask about the poster. I don't know, but if there are other questions, we can also do a live question.
If you raise your hand, we can get you live to ask the question.
Maybe the other question I have for you, thank you. The other question I have for you, Eleanor, how do you engage your audience? How do you ensure they're asking? Is there a way to not almost plant questions, but to guide people to asking the right questions from your presentation?
That's a good question, Pam. I've found, I mean, so now I'm invited to give 1 hour talks. So that gives me a lot of leeway. um, I found that telling a story really engages your audience from start to finish. You tell a story, and then they know from whence you came to where you're going and what happened. So certainly, if you're doing something that is clinically relevant, if you can start from the basic fundamental science and go all the way through to the clinical, that's it's a lovely story. Um, I think you engage your audience by being appreciative of where they're at. If it's an audience of just trainees, then you want to excite them about what the trainee contributions are and what the potential for a trainee is. If your audience is predominantly very well established senior lecturers, then I adjust the talk to be cognizant of their expertise and show them the relevance again. In terms of planting questions, you can leave out some key points from a particular figure that somebody might then want to follow up. I tend not to do that. I will respect the intelligence of the audience and appreciate if they have questions related to the presentation rather than try and trick them by or leaving something out. But that's my strategy. I don't know if it works for you, then it works for you.
No, that's very good advice. And I'd say another thing is if the audience does ask a question that leaves you stumped or, is maybe even irrelevant to your work, um, being prepared for those scenarios is also important. Being able to say that's something we'll have to think more about, or that's something we haven't considered. A simple answer is much better than sometimes I've been guilty of this. You end up going in these circles that
Yeah.
by the end, everybody's more confused than when the question was asked in the first place. So
Be
something
honest.
like
You don't
I
know the
don't know
answer.
is a good answer sometimes, right?
Absolutely. Be honest. That's a good question. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. It's much better than, well, we will going on, and then people know that you don't really know the answer at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're right at time, and I feel like we covered a lot of ground in 2 hours. And really have to thank the audience for being great participants. And also remind everybody to go on the website, register for the conference in February as well. And the other point being, please give us feedback on what you thought of this session, whether you found it useful, how you'd like us to modify it if we continue organizing these sessions outside of the conference weekend. And finally, some of you have already inquired about certificates for this. If you're interested in a certificate for attendance of this conference, please send us a message starting December 1st, and we'll get those to you by the end of the month. Probably we'll wait for all of the requests to come in and send it in at once. So if you don't hear back right away, just hang on and we'll get you those certificates by the end of the month. Any other comments, Eleanor? Have I missed anything?
No, I don't think so. It's hopefully been an informative morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Where there have been slide presentations, we'll get permission and post them on the website. And we look forward to seeing you all attending the conference in February and March.
Thanks to everyone. And also, I should say a big thanks to our tech team
Absolutely.
who facilitated this.